For most of the time that our species has studied its own history, much of the past has been shrouded in darkness. From the void before the written word, only fragments would emerge. Artifacts, environmental data, inferences based on clues, based on assumptions. Fundamentally, what people were doing before they started writing it down was deeply uncertain. Why did people live where they did, and for how long? Were there myths based on real events, or were they just metaphors? In many ways, the past, before the written word, was little more than a hypothesis. But then, scholars of languages began to notice something. There seemed to be similarities in languages as far apart as Hindi and Persian and Greek and Russian. Languages separated by thousands of miles from the Bay of Bengal to the British Isles shared vocabulary and structure. These came to be known as the Indo-European languages, and they are spoken by some 45% of all humans on Earth today. What was going on? Could all of these languages share a common ancestor? And if so, how did they spread? Then, about 10 years ago, came a technological breakthrough that, in a flash, illuminated entire stretches of our story that had been in darkness. And the story is stranger, more brutal, and more epic than we ever thought. This is the story of how the Indo-Europeans conquered the world. "10,000 years ago, after hundreds of thousands of years of our species' existence, there lived on our planet perhaps 5 to 10 million people. This was probably the point at which more languages were spoken than any other time, peaking at maybe 15,000 languages, each having a few hundred to a few thousand speakers. Then, starting around 9,000 years ago, agriculture spread up into Europe from the Fertile Crescent and down into the Indian subcontinent, where it probably met other cultures of plant domestication in South Asia. At the same time, people were farming rice and millet in China, taro, yams and bananas in New Guinea, and in the Americas, people were growing crops like potatoes, squash and maize. By 5,000 years ago, humans had spread out to most of the habitable spots on Earth. While much of the world was still home to hunter-gatherers, more and more people now lived in permanent settlements, growing crops and keeping domesticated animals. In some places, this would soon reach a considerable level of sophistication, like in Egypt and the Indus Valley. Though so much of this world before the written word is shrouded in mystery, we can assume that at this point in time, 5,000 years ago, no single language family accounted for a particularly large proportion of our species. And yet, today, with the world's population having grown from 10 million to 8 billion, we speak fewer languages, around 7,000, sorted into about 140 families. But here we have that astonishing fact. Roughly 45% of the world's population speaks languages from a single language family, Indo-European. It looks like this, and to be clear, I'm only going to be naming a selection. In Western Europe, you have the Italic or Romance languages, the biggest ones of which are Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, and Romanian, spoken by more than 200 million people in Europe. And the Germanic languages, like English, German, and Dutch, as well as Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian, together adding another 200 million speakers. Then you have more than 300 million Slavic speakers of Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, Czech, Slovak, Bulgarian, Slovene, and Serbo-Croat, plus the Baltic languages of Lithuanian and Latvian, and the Celtic, Albanian, and Greek language branches, which altogether add almost another 30 million speakers. Moving into Asia, you have 200 million speakers of the Iranian languages, including Persian, Pashto, Kurdish, and Baloch. And into the Indian subcontinent, you have the Indo-Aryan languages, from Hindi, Marathi, and Punjabi, to Nepali, Bengali, and Assamese, and even Sinhalese down in Sri Lanka, to name just a few, who together total some 1.5 billion people. All told, more than 3.4 billion people speak some 400 languages that descended from the same tongue, Proto-Indo-European. And this world has been created in just the past 5,000 years. As Laura Spinney describes it, the Big Bang of the Indo-European languages is easily the most important event of the last 5 millennia in the Old World. Every time we speak or write in a descendant of that language, we unwittingly scatter clues as to who the first speakers were and what they believed. They live on through all of us who speak Indo-European today. How did we get here? What has happened in the past 5,000 years to produce this? Well, this isn't a new question. This has been debated by scholars for more than 2 centuries. Archaeology, historical linguistics, and genetics have all been brought to bear on the problem. And it is only very recently that we have been able to hone in on what happened. A broad picture is coming into focus, even as some details are still argued over. So, if we're going to tell this as a story, we need to start at the beginning. Who were the first Indo-European speakers, and where did they live? This video is going to sketch out what we know and how. So, let's begin. Around 3500 BCE, between the Dnieper and the Don rivers in what is now Ukraine, lived a few tribes, cultivating grain, fishing and raising cattle, sheep and goats, keeping their settlements close to the river valleys. These people were themselves a mixed population, mostly between what geneticists call Eastern hunter-gatherers and Caucasus hunter-gatherers, which then mixed with a minority of Ukrainian foragers on what is called the Pontic steppe. They grazed their animals out on the grasslands, but, crucially, they had their home bases and they weren't travelling really huge distances. We now call them the Yamnaya, a name coming from the Russian describing their pit graves, though we have no idea what they called themselves. They buried their dead under kurgans with red ochre. We can tell from genetics that they were patrilineal, with a small number of males doing most of the reproducing with a wide variety of females. Judging from the DNA we find in these burials, they may have been a single clan or brotherhood, and the buried men were certainly closely related. If you were somewhat familiar with the story and the breakthroughs of recent years, you might have already heard the name Yamnaya. Here I'm going to use the term to cover both core Yamnaya, a culture defined narrowly by archaeologists by their burials, as well as the very closely related steppe groups that broadly share the genetics and can be thought of as sister or cousin groups to the core Yamnaya. Together, they are the engine of what is to come. Using the same forensic techniques commonly used in criminal cases, we can say that they were likely brown-haired and brown-eyed. Analysis of skeletons shows us they were substantially taller than the farmers who were present in Europe at that time, close to the height of modern Europeans at 5 feet 10 inches, or perhaps 6 foot, compared to an average of 5 feet 4 inches for the farmers. But their predicted IQ was probably lower than the farmers then present in Europe and the Near East, and lower than modern Europeans. So far, nothing special. These tribes, together numbering in the low tens of thousands at most, weren't more advanced than many of their contemporaries in Europe or the Middle East, and they certainly hadn't achieved anything like the civilizational scale that would soon emerge in Old Kingdom Egypt or the Indus Valley. But then something changed. They began to expand. A lot. Some geneticists estimate that between 5 and 10%, perhaps as high as 12%, of the ancestry of all people alive today ultimately traces back to these steppe herders. Think about that. From perhaps tens of thousands of people, if you put together all the surviving DNA fragments from this ancient group, it would account for around 700 million humans, according to geneticist Razib Khan. How? Well, the key to that is where they were living, because they were living on the steppe. This is the steppe, and nowhere has more steppe than Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan contains the largest continuous stretch of steppe in the world, comparable in size to the country of Turkey. One summer, I took a journey across it. Technically speaking, steppe is an ecoregion characterized by grassland plains without closed forests, except near rivers and lakes. It is pretty dry, getting similar rainfall to southern Spain or the southern United States, hence why it can't support forests, and typically has wild swings of temperature, from highs of 26 degrees in the summer to negative 18 degrees in winter. Much of the steppe is considered semi-desert, with grasslands or shrubs in other places. The Kazakh steppe is part of the larger Eurasian steppe. Starting in Hungary in the west, this ribbon of grassland stretches almost unbroken to the Pacific, sandwiched between the forests of the taiga to the north and mountains and deserts to the south. The steppe is so massive, it spans 8 time zones, or 8,000 kilometers. The Kazakh steppe begins at the southern end of the Ural Mountains, traditionally the dividing line between Europe and Asia. The west of the Kazakh steppe is sparsely populated, with only a couple of people per square kilometer on average, and we only occasionally pass small towns. What people do there, what their lives are like, I can hardly imagine, but the stops are welcome for everyone. As you go east, the Kazakh steppe gets wetter, and the population density increases. One can look out at the epic sameness and imagine how people used to cross it. How did people used to live here, and what made this environment one of the most important in human history? The thing about the steppe is that it is not actually very good for growing crops, at least until the advent of modern irrigation. Agriculture is thought to be necessary for people to reach the high population densities needed to build cities and civilizations. As writer Peter Nimitz describes it, the wide expanses of grass that covered the steppe for 8,000 kilometers could sustain cows and horses, but not men. The humans, until about 5,500 years ago, were concentrated in the river valleys, where there was enough water to irrigate crops with and enough game to hunt in the forest. Because they couldn't reliably intensively grow crops in the grassland, the vast stretches in between rivers couldn't support anything other than tiny populations. So, for most of human history, the steppe was not much more than a sideshow in the great story of our species. But then it changed, and it was changed by a couple of transformative, world-shaking technologies: the horse and the wheel. We can't be sure exactly where the wheel was invented. In archaeological terms, from the Near East to Eastern Europe, the wheel starts to pop up between 4000 and 3500 BCE. Up until this point, mobility was limited to what a person could carry, or perhaps load onto an animal. A human can plausibly carry 15 to 25 kilograms, but by 3500 to 3000 BCE, people had developed wagons that could carry hundreds of kilograms, maybe even 1,000. The wagons were simple and probably pulled by oxen, but they could carry a lot more than humans by themselves, for example, shelter. Then there is the horse. The Yamnaya were not the first people to tame the horse. We are fairly sure that a separate culture called the Botai had at least semi-domesticated it far further to the east from the Yamnaya, around 3500 BCE. There is some recent work on Yamnaya skeletons showing evidence of horseback riding, and though we can't quite be certain, it seems increasingly likely that they were riding horses, and we are fairly sure they were drinking their milk. Though horses may not have yet been strong enough to use in warfare, if they were riding them, horses would have greatly increased the efficiency of animal herding. On horseback, people could herd 2 or 3 times more animals. As Razib Khan writes, the domestication of the horse by the Yamnaya is circumstantial, but the circumstance in question is the conquest of much of Europe in the space of a few brief generations. Such a feat seems miraculous. For my money, the horse is the missing piece we need to render comprehensible the unprecedented speed of the Yamnaya advance across and far beyond the steppe. It's hard to overstate the revolution that horse domestication brought about. As Razib puts it, hunting, gathering, eventually even farming, these essential pursuits entailed endless walking, schlepping, dragging, and lifting. Horsepower supercharged agriculture, transport, communication, and warfare. In each case, horses both provided an instant upgrade to human abilities and catalyzed a chain of progressive improvements and innovations that would enable civilizational advancements to compound on ever grander, more awesome scales. Horses were our gateway superpower. So, sometime around the middle of the 4th millennium BCE, a new lifestyle came together. Ox-drawn carts plus horses, and this allowed people to exploit the steppe to a degree that had never been seen before. Permanent settlements became rarer. Now that they could follow them with their wagons and tents, huge herds of animals could be kept and moved across the grasslands. The vast energy reserves of an ecosystem the size of the United States could be converted into as much meat and milk as people could ever hope for. A new environment had been tamed, and in terms of the long history of our species, It happened in a flash. Around 3300 BCE, the Yamnaya's numbers started to explode and they swept across the steppe, as far east as the Ural Mountains and as far west as the Carpathians within a few hundred years. This was an expansion so rapid that archaeologists have found men buried 5,000 years ago in the Altai Mountains on the edge of Mongolia who are just a few generations apart, perhaps with a common great-great-great-grandfather of individuals 4,000 kilometers away in eastern Slovakia. They had, as Razib describes it, gone nomad, and they took the mother of all Indo-European languages with them. This new way of life is called nomadic pastoralism, which is to say moving with your animals and living off their products. But this lifestyle that proved so effective was also almost perfectly designed to leave no traces. There were no lost cities to be uncovered, no stone temples. These were people on the move, leaving little behind other than their burial mounds, the kurgans, which later archaeologists could trace like breadcrumbs as they moved east and west. As Razib writes, the steppe peoples of history, and especially prehistory, are one of our species' great black holes, a yawning void stretched nearly the full width of our supercontinent and exerting its outsized pull on our development for over 5 millennia. These nameless people left no monuments or seminal texts. Instead, we live with their language, their gods, and their genes. And it's only recent technological breakthroughs that have pushed back some of that darkness. Europe, the old continent and an old culture. In places like Austria, people leave the house wearing things like this and still expect to be taken seriously. Despite this, the people of Central Europe have reached a considerable level of sophistication. Europe, you could say, is a civilization.
What do you call this? Milchramstrudel. Gamknödel.
This Germanic culture is part of the Indo-European family as well. But how old is the culture exactly? How similar are the people of Europe today to those who lived here in the past? The language they speak, and indeed their blood, has its origin not in these mountains, but in the grasslands of the steppe. So, remember how we talked about the invention of agriculture? Starting around 9,000 years ago, people, who we now call Anatolian farmers, began to spread from what is now Turkey through the Balkans and up into Europe. With their package of farming technologies, they were far more productive than the foragers who had inhabited Europe for tens of thousands of years before them. By 5500 BCE, the farmers had reached Germany, and Britain and Ireland by 4000 BCE. With the remaining pockets of hunter-gatherers relegated to the fringes. Cultures and complex societies developed. These are the people that built Stonehenge in Britain and developed the elaborate goldworking of the Varna culture in Bulgaria. A potter of the Hamangia culture gave us what might be the first known depiction of thought in all of art. In material terms, Europe was one of the most advanced regions on Earth. Don't get attached. They don't last long. Starting around 5,000 years ago, we can see a change in the archaeological record. The material culture simplifies, the pottery changes, and that pottery shows more intensive use of milk products. In much of Central and Northern Europe, large settlements disappear from the record, replaced by more scattered farmsteads. And importantly, historical linguists studying the Indo-European languages estimate that their expansion and subsequent divergence must have started at some time around this point. The question always was, did the Indo-European languages spread through cultural diffusion or mass migration? Did a new elite come in and impose their languages and culture onto the pre-existing people, or were whole populations replaced by ones who spoke the new languages? There was particular disagreement between most archaeologists, who mostly argued for cultural diffusion through elite dominance, and most historical linguists, who mostly argued for population replacement. Well, now we have our answer. Without getting into excessively complicated genetics, just as the steppe world was transformed by the horse and the wheel, our understanding of our own past has been transformed by a couple of crucial technologies. The first was the arrival of cheap whole genome sequencing, which allowed entire human genomes to be analysed at scale. And the second was figuring out how to reliably read DNA from ancient bones, instead of having to infer purely from the genetics of people alive today. By triangulating between the entire genomes of remains in different grave sites buried at different times, and also with the genomes of people alive today, scientists can estimate with increasing accuracy the movement of people across space and time. We can then compare mitochondrial DNA, which is passed on only along the female line, with the genetics of the Y chromosome, which is passed only on the male line, plus rates of mutation to create a picture of who reproduced with whom and when. The first ancient DNA papers started coming out around 2010, with the first real blockbuster studies on steppe ancestry starting to come out in 2015. By 2023, we had sequenced 10,000 ancient genomes, 100 times more than we had just a decade earlier. In the past 10 years, we've probably made more progress in our understanding of Indo-European prehistory than in the previous 2 centuries. It's been called the ancient DNA revolution, and revolution is not too strong a word. More and more discoveries keep tumbling out of this field so rapidly that you need to follow it by the month. If you're interested in what we're learning from ancient genetics, I would recommend following Razib Khan on Substack, who I quote extensively in this video. So these new results from multiple labs that have been reproduced since were unambiguous. The people from the steppe, the ones who buried their dead under kurgans, completely overturned the human landscape of Europe, starting 5,000 years ago. The people that brought farming to Europe, the Anatolian farmers, the people of Stonehenge and the Varna culture, were supplanted. We're talking about mass migration, almost overnight overturning the demographics of much of Europe. The cultures that had created the continent's first civilizations collapsed. Now, crucially, the steppe more or less ends in Hungary, making pastoral nomadism far less suited to most of Europe. So the culture of the Yamnaya and steppe people would need to change. And change it did, as the newcomers mixed with the European farmers they encountered, called the globular amphora culture after their style of pottery, which itself was a mixture of mostly Anatolian farmers and hunter-gatherers. Within a few hundred years of their entry into Europe, by around 2900 BCE, they formed a new culture, called the corded Ware, whose genetics were around 70 to 75% steppe, with the rest coming from the globular amphora or other farmer groups. And yes, it is slightly annoying that all of these names are kind of lame, but we don't know what they called themselves, so we just have to follow convention and call them after their pottery. The steppe people had adapted, taking what they needed from the people they collided with. Many of the words for specific crops and farming techniques in Northern Europe seem to be non-Indo-European loans because the steppe people didn't really farm. The farming and pottery technology came from the people they conquered. But, and this is important, most of their genetics was from the steppe. Pockets of people untouched by the steppe arrivals remained, but the corded Ware would soon come to dominate most of Northern and Eastern Europe. In not much more than 50 years, they blazed a path from Poland all the way to the northwestern edge of Europe. They burnt the forests as they went, clearing it to graze their herds. According to the Danish archaeologist Christian Christensen, they simply recreated the steppe in Northern Europe. According to Razib, within a few centuries of 3000 BC, Neolithic Europe had wholly collapsed. Their arrival also marked the end of the fertile era of the artisan, the megalith builder, and indeed of the great mega-village. Night fell over Neolithic Europe. Another pulse westwards, probably out of the corded Ware, met with a cultural complex called the Beakers that had its origins in Iberia, whose pot-making style had spread across Europe. They fused with it, adopting their material culture, but coming to dominate it. In the Beaker culture, the steppe invaders were slightly less genetically dominant than they were in the corded Ware, and the material culture changed less, but the picture was broadly similar. A significant replacement of farmer genetics with steppe. After 2600 BCE, they had become dominant in France, 2500 BCE in Britain, and 2300 BCE in Iberia. Broadly speaking, the further south you go, the less steppe ancestry you get. And there is a wrinkle. Let's return to the Y chromosome, which is passed on only from father to son. Before 3000 BCE, there were many different Y chromosome lineages present throughout Europe. They had names like I2, G2A, C1A2, and H2. These male lineages of Europe collapsed dramatically. In the core regions of these new cultures, one or a couple of Y chromosome lineages came to dominate the male population. They were the lineages from the steppe. So when we talk about the genetics of the corded ware being 70% steppe, or the bell beakers being 30 to 50% steppe, this understates a part of the story. Of that non-steppe ancestry, most of it was from women. The maternal lineages were diverse. The paternal lineages were not. More often than not, across the continent, steppe males absolutely dominated the farmers that preceded them. A few hyper-dominant men became the ancestors of literally hundreds of millions of people. This was patriarchy on steroids at a continental scale. Among the steppe pastoralists back in what is now Ukraine, two particular Y chromosome lineages were dominant, R1A and R1B. The core Yamnaya, at least those buried under the kurgans, were virtually all R1B, and subsequently so were the bell beakers. Conversely, though the corded ware share about 3/4 of the overall DNA with the Yamnaya, their Y chromosomes were mostly R1A. By the way, keep in mind these haplogroup names, R1A and R1B, because they're going to pop up later in the story. Exactly how this worked with particular male lineages dominating in different places still has to be worked out. But when we look at the DNA as a whole, the picture is clear. The Yamnaya and closely related clans, to a significant degree, replaced the people of Europe. When they first arrived, they may be numbered in the tens of thousands. The population of Europe was perhaps 7 million, and yet the steppe people came and imposed their genes and their languages. How? Portugal marks the westernmost extent of Europe and of the Indo-European expansion. Today, around 60% of Portuguese males have the same Y chromosome as the Yamnaya. The steppe reached even here. How did these nomads conquer Europe within a handful of generations? There are a few factors that possibly contributed. Climate may have played a role. As much of Europe cooled and became more arid starting around 3200 BCE, herding may have become more practical than farming in some places. Disease could also have been a factor. With the pastoralists living especially close to a lot of animals, pathogens could have jumped from livestock to human, and the steppe people may have developed immunity before the settled farmers of Europe encountered these new diseases. Or maybe the mobility of the pastoralists meant they were less tied to fixed settlements where disease could spread, giving them an advantage. But the question most people are prompted to ask is, how violent was it? Well, this is also much debated, and the thinking on this has shifted. After the first ancient DNA results started to come through, the complete domination of European male farmers by steppe men was assumed to be violent. I mean, how could it not be? It now seems possible, though, that given that this change took a couple of hundred years, incredibly quickly in the history of our species, but still encompassing a dozen or so generations, it is mathematically possible that with a steppe-descended elite having privileged access to females, it could have happened without literal genocide. Maybe the cultural package these steppe groups brought with them, of mobile patrilineal clans and warrior brotherhoods, helped to maintain social cohesion across large distances. This could have systematically advantaged a few steppe male lineages, with farmer men having lower status and fewer children. As Laura Spinney writes, the Indo-Europeans may simply have been good at having children and keeping them alive. If they kept it up over generations, steppe ancestry would have spread through the population and Indo-European languages with it. Over centuries, this kind of social system could almost eliminate farmer male lineages without literal continent-wide genocide. The corded ware and bell beaker cultures may not have needed constant war to keep expanding. However, as far as we can currently tell from the genomes that have been sequenced, and by now we have a lot of ancient European genomes, the shift that put a small number of steppe males at the top of the hierarchy happened extremely quickly after 3000 BCE. In most of the well-studied parts of Europe, the picture is clear. There was no slow, gentle fade-out of Europe's male farmers. Instead, steppe-derived cultures, dominated by a small number of men, very quickly won control of Europe, in a way that meant that it was the steppe-derived men that did most of the reproducing. Even if it wasn't literally a case of the steppe males charging into Europe and slaughtering the male farmers and taking their women, we are left with a simple fact. While there is still plenty of variation in mitochondrial DNA, which is passed from a mother to her children, in most of Western Europe today, aside from recent immigrants from other regions of the world, the majority of the native male lineages are either R1a or R1b. This is pretty strongly hinted at in the archaeological record. As Razib Khan writes, their pastoralist world flourished atop the smouldering ruins of worlds lost. Though they left their legacy in flesh, archaeologically, the early Indo-Europeans are ghosts. They emerged out of darkness beyond the view of history, and they brought darkness to many lands they conquered. Northern Europe's first known civilization disappeared so utterly and with such finality, a golden age unrecorded and unmourned. It lies just beyond the reach of history, its most imposing attainments scattered across the landscape, cold totems of a lost age. He might be on the more extreme end in his interpretation of the data, but when we put the evidence together, we see a massive shift in the demography of the entire continent. An even larger shift, specifically amongst the males, a whole new set of burial practices, and no more Neolithic megasites. But the place with the highest steppe ancestry in Europe might surprise you. 90% of the native British genome today comes from the steppe, even more than on the continent. In Britain, the people that built Stonehenge were part of the same continuum of farmers that existed in Europe before the steppe invasions. Now, only about 10% of the whole genome of native British today derives from them. The rest is steppe, in Britain's case coming from the Beakers. And yes, it too was an invasion of men. On the Y chromosome, the Brits are majority R1b as well. No. One evening I have dinner with my friend Bimba. Like I did, she grew up in New Zealand, but her family is Sinhalese from Sri Lanka, 8,700 kilometres from where we were in London. And yet, Sri Lanka, too, all those miles away, is part of the Indo-European world. A reminder that the story of the Indo-Europeans is just getting started. So in Europe, steppe ancestry is everywhere, though it decreases as you go south and west. One of the few places left relatively unscathed was Sardinia. Today there is little steppe ancestry there, and they are the closest living relatives to the farmers who ruled most of Europe before the arrival of the steppe people. But sitting above all of this talk of genetics and archaeology, we have the simplest of facts. Europe almost everywhere switched to the language of the steppe, what we are calling Indo-European. Even in Sardinia they speak Sardinian, an Indo-European language. All but 4 European languages today are part of the Indo-European language family. The exceptions are Hungarian, Finnish, Estonian, and Basque. And what about them? Well, Finnish and Estonian arrived a couple of thousand years after the Indo-European languages, coming down from Siberia and the Arctic from the other side of the Ural Mountains. Hungarian arrived a little over 1,000 years ago, and genetically speaking, the Magyar population that invaded and formed an elite in Hungary was small enough and subsequently mixed enough that modern Hungarians are broadly like their geographic neighbours, with a similar steppe inheritance. And then there are the Basques. A few years ago, when I was in my 20s, I spent a year living in the Basque country. It is a land of lush, low, rolling mountains and rugged coastline. One of the first things you learn in the Basque country is that it is different, and it is special. Basque, or Euskara, is a tongue unrelated to any other, a true language isolate surrounded by Indo-European. And they are proud of it. Until a few years ago, they even had a terrorist group, ETA, that fought for Basque independence from Spain. You see the flag, the Icorinha, everywhere. They are extremely eager to define themselves as different from the Indo-European speakers they live beside. Today, one of the best places to see that extremely strong Basque identity is to go to the football. Athletic Bilbao is a sports team completely unlike any other in the world of professional sports. Only players who are born in the Basque country or who learned their football skills at a Basque club are allowed to play for them. And yet, despite this, and the fact that there are only some 3 million Basques, they are one of only 3 teams never to have been relegated from the Spanish First Division. And the potency of that distinctiveness is never more on display than when Real Madrid, who for many Basques symbolize the Spanish state, against whom many Basques identify themselves, come to town. So here is a non-Indo-European speaking people in a sea of Indo-European speakers. Are they a pre-Indo-European people that somehow survived the steppe invasions? Well, no. At least genetically. Genetically, they show a similar pattern to the rest of Spain and France and Western Europe, a mixture of steppe and European farmer and hunter-gatherer, but with this non-steppe ancestry coming disproportionately from females, and an overwhelming steppe domination of the male line. More than 80% of Basque Y chromosomes belong to R1b lineages that spread from the steppe and were dominant in the Beaker culture. In fact, Basques actually have more steppe ancestry than the Spanish speakers that surround them, because in the rest of Spain, that ancestry has subsequently been diluted by mixing due to the Roman and Arab empires, which the Basques resisted. Gene flow into the Basque population effectively ended around 2,500 years ago. So in that sense, it is true that they are a people apart from their neighbours, even if they, too, are kind of Yamnaya. We don't know why the Basque language was the only non-Indo-European language to survive in Western Europe. There are theories about them having a stronger role for women in their culture, and it was the women who passed their native language onto their children. But we don't actually know. Euskara, however, may be the last linguistic legacy of Europe before the arrival of the Indo-Europeans. So where does that leave us? Around 5,000 years ago, there was a massive influx of steppe people into Europe, mostly men, that replaced the male lineages of much of the continent and created new hybrid steppe farmer cultures. The steppe replacement ranged from massive in northern and eastern Europe to substantial in southern and western Europe. The lineages of those steppe males, the descendants of the nomadic warriors, still dominate. Here on the map you can see the proportions of all the Y haplogroups that are R1b, which was prominent in the core Yamnaya, and R1a, found in their near neighbours on the steppe. In corded Ware areas, mainly in Eastern Europe, R1a is dominant, while in Beaker areas, in Western and Southern Europe, R1b is the main lineage. But time waits for no man. The original Yamnaya culture had vanished from the steppe by around 2600 BCE, subsumed by its descendants. And with climatic changes, the corded Ware and Beakers faded in turn. But genetically, the population of Europe 4,000 years ago is not far off what it is today, aside from modern intercontinental migration, a three-way mix of the Ice Age hunter-gatherers, Anatolian farmers, and steppe herders. We don't know when speakers of Indo-Europeans stopped being able to understand each other, though that had almost certainly already happened by around 2000 BCE. Over time, the language that originally came from the steppe diverged into branches of Indo-European: Germanic, Balto-Slavic, Celtic, and Italic, and these families gave us the languages of Europe that we know and love today. By the middle of the first millennium BCE, Celtic was spoken across the continent, from Spain as far as Turkey. The Celtic branch, though today existing mostly in the British Isles, was almost certainly born on the mainland, and much of Central Europe used to speak it, reaching its maximum extent in the 3rd century BCE. Today, the most important are Breton, Irish, Scottish Gaelic, and Welsh. Proto-Germanic was still confined to its heartland until around the 3rd century CE, by which time it had split into a northern branch, leading to Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, and Icelandic, an eastern branch, including the now extinct Gothic, which was still being spoken in the Crimea as late as the 18th century, and a western branch, including German and Dutch. German speakers crossed the English Channel in the 5th century, pushing Welsh and Cornish to the peripheries and inventing Old English. The expansion of Germanic languages pushed Celtic out of much of continental Europe, as did the growth of the Italic languages, especially Latin, across Western and Southern Europe, largely due to the Roman Empire. The biggest Italic languages today, of course, are Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, and Romanian. To the north and east, you have the Baltic and Slavic languages, likely once a single tongue. The biggest Baltic languages today are Latvian and Lithuanian, though there used to be more. Slavic went wandering and diverged into a Western group that includes Polish and Czech, an Eastern group of Ukrainian, Russian, and Belarusian, and a Southern group of Serbo-Croat and Bulgarian. Pulling back the camera a little, there are also Greek, Albanian, and Armenian, which likely emerged from later pulses of Yamnaya, probably after 2500 BCE, that were separate to the movements that created the corded Ware and Beakers. It is quite likely that Greek and Armenian are more closely related to each other than to Albanian, but probably diverged on the steppe, with Greek going south through the Balkans and Armenian through the Caucasus, where we can see the familiar kurgans appear in Armenia between 2500 and 2000 BCE. Today, 25% of Armenian males have the exact R1b Y chromosome that was so distinctive of the Yamnaya. Albanian likely came south through a separate migration. Greek, Albanian, and Armenian, all, to different degrees, are accompanied with visible injections of steppe genetics, especially on the Y chromosome, even if the genetic turnover was considerably less dramatic than what we see in Northern and Western Europe. So Greeks, Albanians, and Armenians are Yamnaya in a sense also, but did not descend from the corded Ware like their European siblings. There is also an entire family of Anatolian languages, such as Hittite, that are now extinct, but of which we actually have surviving writing, the earliest from between 1800 and 1700 BCE, written in cuneiform. Whether they are classified as Indo-European or a sister language family is to a certain extent semantic, but we can be reasonably confident now, thanks to very recent genetic work, that they arose from a migration south into Anatolia by a population that was very similar to the Yamnaya, but just before the formation of the Yamnaya themselves on the Pontic steppe. This, very roughly, is the European part of the Indo-European story. Today, most of Europe speaks a European language in one of these 8 language branches: Celtic, Germanic, Italic, Baltic, Slavic, Albanian, Greek, or Armenian. But this is only a part of the tale, and if we're talking about the importance of the Indo-Europeans today, in some ways it is only a sideshow. And for the full story, we have to go east. The Taklamakan Desert today sits in Xinjiang in western China. To the north, it faces the Tian Shan Mountains. To the west, the roof of the world, the Pamirs. And to the south, the Karakoram and the Kunlun Ranges. Even to the east, it faces the Gobi Desert. It couldn't be more landlocked or isolated. Starting in the 2nd millennium BCE, however, people learned to capture the water running off the mountains and began to use it to irrigate crops. By 3,000 years ago, urban centres had grown out of these oases and would soon become vital nodes of what would later become the Silk Roads, reaching their peak between the 5th and 10th centuries CE. But in the late 1st millennium, these cities began to decline and eventually die. They were buried in the sand and they were forgotten. So forgotten, in fact, that it wasn't until the 19th century that they were rediscovered. And what those first explorers found in the desert surprised everyone. Here was a long-lost Buddhist civilization. Then, in 1908, scholars announced that one of these previously unknown languages was Indo-European. They called it Tocharian. How was that possible? An Indo-European language once spoken in the Far East. How had it crossed the length of Eurasia to reach what is now China? Well, as they were expanding, shortly before the Yamnaya were using their supercharged cultural package to surge westwards into Europe, another set of Yamnaya were doing the same thing, headed in the other direction. We can first track them all the way across the steppe and what is now Russia, where we call them the Afanasyevo culture. And they carry our now familiar Yamnaya R1b haplotype. The Afanasyevo were essentially pure Yamnaya, and they arrived in Western Mongolia around 3300 BCE. We now also have evidence of people culturally and genetically very much like the Afanasyevo further south in the Hungarian basin, around 3000 to 2800 BCE. The last part, the clincher, would be proof of their genetics showing up in the Tarim basin itself, where the Tocharians built their civilization. But we don't yet have it. However, given that the broad consensus among linguists that Tocharian was the first branch to separate from the Indo-European tree, and that we have firm genetic evidence of direct descendants of the Yamnaya just a little north, it doesn't seem like much of a stretch to assume that over the course of a couple of millennia, they made their way a few hundred kilometers over the mountains into the Tarim basin and planted their Indo-European language, which eventually blossomed into a hybrid civilization, which was then lost. Still, it's pretty cool, right? The real story of the East, however, happens a millennium after the Afanasyevo were making their trek across the steppe, because they were followed by another group, and it is that group who are really, in terms of the number of speakers at least, the main event in the story of the Indo-Europeans. To catch up with them, we need to go back to the steppe. On the steppe, you really notice the settlements. There isn't much else to notice. It kind of feels like you're in the middle of nowhere. And yet, some 4,000 years ago, these grasslands once birthed technologies that changed the world. Not that you can tell. This is Aktobe, in northern Kazakhstan. It is like most of the other mid-sized Soviet cities on the Kazakh steppe. It started out as a Russian military fort from the middle of the 19th century, because before then, the steppe knew no cities. Here, the Soviet legacy is visible. Today, it is largely a mixture of Indo-European speaking ethnic Russians and non-Indo-European Kazakhs. They are the ones that hang their carpets on the playgrounds. In this part of the world, they like their architecture big. Monumental, in fact. Near the big mosque in town is the fast food restaurant I'm. If it looks familiar, that isn't surprising. In early 2023, McDonald's pulled out of Kazakhstan due to what they said were supply shortages following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Its future is uncertain. Tragic, really, because following its exit from Kazakhstan, McDonald's doesn't have any presence at all anywhere in Central Asia. Aktobe has a theme park and a football team. This is their stadium, and I can see they have ultras, as well as cutouts of sexy mamas and papas on their phones, flashing a little belly in the winds that whip across the Eurasian steppe. It's not hard to see horses in Aktobe, or in Kazakhstan, or on the steppe. Can you spot the horses on Kazakhstan's emblem? But the one thing I didn't expect to see here was a Humvee stretch limo. I visit the Russian Orthodox Church. Aktobe is built to be spacious. I guess because on the steppe, space is well supplied. The sky is large in such a city, and you can see the storms roll in. Inconvenient for me, but a good excuse for another cheeseburger. I can't help but think about mobility here in Aktobe. It's a city built for the automobile, but it's not the only way to get around. This is what a steppe city looks like in the early 21st century. This is how people live here. To get around, there are cars and buses and trucks and trains. Though, disappointingly, I didn't see a single person riding a horse. But of course, it wasn't always so, and Aktobe wasn't the first permanent settlement on the steppe. People have been building here for thousands of years. Further north and across the Russian border was another settlement carved, like Aktobe, out of the sameness of the Eurasian grasslands. Unlike Aktobe, however, it would play a significant role in the great arc of the Indo-Europeans. So one branch of this corded ware culture, this fusion of the Yamnaya with European farmers, replaced much of the people of Europe. But that wasn't all, because after that, about 1,000 years, another branch backtracked, heading back east from where they had come from. They were mostly of steppe ancestry, but crucially had that characteristic splash of European farmer heritage that marks out the corded ware. By 4,000 years ago, they had paused south of the Ural Mountains, where we now call them the Sintashta, after the closest town to one of their settlements, near Aktobe in northern Kazakhstan and southern Russia. They didn't do much farming, but they did settle in small, fortified towns. And there, they did something that would supercharge the Indo-European expansion across Eurasia. Despite the fact that horses had already been domesticated, it was likely the Sintashta, or a nearby culture, who transformed the horse into a weapon of war. Out of the nearly 60 million domesticated horses today, virtually everyone traces its ancestry to those tamed by the Sintashta, or a nearby culture, in the southern Urals. By practicing selective breeding, they made these horses stronger and more easily tamed. The earlier domestications were replaced by this one. Their rapid and almost complete adoption, a marker of this mobility revolution. This was the final domestication. And what were they bred for? Well, this time, for warfare. Because the second thing the Sintashta did, sometime around 2000 BCE, was to invent the light war chariot, along with improved bits and harnesses for riding, which would touch off a military revolution. If riding horses was indeed a key development for the success of the Yamnaya, the combo of these souped-up horses with the light war chariots was almost as revolutionary. It spread across Eurasia. Communication networks could be far wider, and their use in war greatly raised the scale of military conflict. Though a detailed narrative history is not yet possible, this package likely fueled the next, and the greatest, expansion of the Indo-Europeans. They would once again leave the steppe and come to dominate another cradle of civilization. By around 1900 to 1800 BCE, the Sintashta had started to spread out of the southern Urals as they moved across the steppe into the Altai in Central Asia. These varied cultures are now grouped together as the Andronovo. In Central Asia, the Andronovo came into contact with oasis cities, a part of a larger civilization called the Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex. Between 2100 and 1700 BCE, steppe genetics start to show up, and starting around 1900 BCE, the major centers shrink sharply. This process isn't what it looked like in Europe. This was less like a demographic wave, and perhaps more like gradual admixture as a result of elite dominance. Steppe warriors with their new military technologies coming in and taking the reins, though that is, to some extent, a guess. And it's probably from here that we get a couple of separate streams, which we'll look at one at a time. In Central Asia, we see increasing steppe genetics over the 2nd millennium BCE, while in Iran itself, we see a lot less genetic turnover. Both were probably zones of non-Indo-European languages. In Iran, some are attested to, like Elamite, but what languages were spoken in the Central Asian oases before the arrival of the Indo-Europeans is anybody's guess. While there is a limit to what we can tell about the story from the genetic evidence we currently have, what we can survey is the aftermath, the world of Iranian languages that was created by this mixing of steppe people with the settled cultures they encountered. We know they spread, but we don't know exactly how. We know that the steppe signature that appears was clearly related to the Andronovo, and therefore the Sintashta, who both bred the most successful horse lineage ever and probably invented the light war chariot, but beyond that is to some extent mysterious. Perhaps the best model we have is the steppe warriors came in and installed themselves at the top of the hierarchy and made their language the elite one, which then filtered down over centuries. According to Razib Khan, Sintashta steppe ancestry first appears in the DNA record of northeastern Iran some 4,000 years ago, spreading southwest over the next 1,000 years. Historical linguistics also suggests that the Iranian languages were spreading and diverging across the Iranian plateau in the late 2nd millennium. We know that the Iranian languages were fairly widespread in Western Iran by the early 1st millennium BCE, when the Iranian-speaking Medes are written about by the Assyrians, and by the 6th century BCE we see the decidedly non-nomadic Achaemenid kings of Cyrus, Darius and Xerxes first illuminated in the flickering light of written history, when we first get their royal proclamations written in Old Persian. The only way we can tell they came originally from the steppe is from their language. On top of that, we can get some clues from the world of religion, specifically the archetypal old Iranian religion of Zoroastrianism, the first texts of which were in Avestan, an Iranian language, composed orally sometime between 1500 and 900 BCE, making Avestan the oldest attested Iranian language. Today, between half and 60% of the population of the country of Iran are Persians. Their language, Persian, is called Farsi in Iran, Tajik in Central Asia, and Dari in Afghanistan, all for the most part mutually intelligible. Add these variants together and it is spoken by upwards of 120 million people. But it's further north where we see substantially more genetic turnover that the Iranians become a force of their own. This is Jambul in the Kazakh Altai. It's not the steppe, but we're here to find something in particular. First though, we stop in to get some honey.
Это вот кормовые, гнездовые. Детей выводят, маток выводят. Вот это вот медогонка называется.
This woman is speaking in Russian, a distant cousin of English,
Типа центрифуги.
one of the European branches of the Indo-European family, dropped into these mountains by the tides of empire in the last 2 centuries. Her language, if you roll back through time enough years, would join with English and German, and indeed Persian. Can you hear any similarities?
Здесь 24 рамки. И он по стенкам потом сбегает,
и вот так.
и потом сливаем. Ну, есть, конечно, электрические, есть вот такие вот, есть маленькие рамочки, вот которые в верхних вот этих вот ящичках, такие рамочки. Они полностью закрыты, например, медом. Сейчас уже все откачано. Вот такие рамочки мы вот.
In this part of the world, people have been moving and replacing each other for a long time. Even 2,500 years later, the steppe still speaks, if you know what to listen for.
Перга, ой, пыльца, вот с их вот этим медом, с ферментом, это называется перга. Это пчелиный хлеб. Ну, тоже природа. Живот. Сейчас уже холодно, все равно все умирать начнут. Также разжигаешь, и вот такой вот корёшка пихта. Пихта, у нее запах приятнее.
Because these mountains once didn't speak Russian, or indeed Kazakh. They spoke Iranian. I take a fridge magnet and we get going. We have a photo shoot for a bottle of water. And then some lunch. But what we really came to see was inside this kurgan. Now, admittedly, I had been expecting to see a real kurgan with some real remains instead of this tacky recreation. But this is Central Asia, and a tacky recreation is never far away. The museum has some artifacts on display. These objects, once the material reality of everyday life, were fashioned and used by Iranian men, women, and children more than 2,500 years ago. Whoever was buried here, he was a Scythian. Who were the Scythians? Scythian is a term used by the Greeks to denote various steppe confederacies at different points in history, who were also called Saka by the Persians. They were almost certainly not a single entity that persisted over time, but a series of multi-ethnic steppe confederacies. However, their main language was an Iranian one. Whether they be called Scythian, Saka, Sarmatians, or Alans, on the Eurasian steppe, by the first millennium, there existed a vast Iranian world. We can't be sure how homogeneously Iranian it was, because most of what we know comes from the writing of the settled people, who they would continuously harass. They would plunder Persia and battle with Alexander the Great. For the Scythians, the chariot would be relegated as a primary weapon of war, because a new weapon system had been perfected: mounted archers. Scythian, or at least Scythian-related confederations stretched from Ukraine to Mongolia. It was the Scythians that for the first time turned the combination of horse, man, and bow into a singular fighting machine. The language of the Scythians survives today in a pocket of the North Caucasus, which we now call Ossetian. So the Iranian world is much larger than the country that is now called Iran, and used to be even larger still. So fast forwarding a few thousand years from the Iranian expansion to today, and across a broad belt of Asia, you have a patchwork of Iranian languages, ultimately descended from the Sintashta, from Kurdish in the west to Persian to the languages of the High Pamirs, Pashto in Afghanistan and Baloch in Pakistan, and that's just naming the big ones. This is the village of Jizu in the Pamir Mountains of Tajikistan.
Yogurt with blackberry jam is the best thing ever.
While most of lowland Tajikistan speaks Tajik, a variant of Persian, up in these mountains they speak Pamiri languages in the Eastern Iranian family, more closely related to Pashto, which is widely spoken in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Up here in the High Pamirs, there are around half a dozen languages with names like Shugni, Sarikoli, and Yazgolami, some not even mutually intelligible, having drifted apart in their isolation in their mountain valleys, and many only having a few thousand speakers.
Animals died or something, and only in that case the people just bring it.
On the morning I spent in Jizu, a man had just returned from spending the night up in the pasture with his flock. He had to butcher one of his animals that had been killed by either rockfall or a snow leopard, and carried it back down to the village.
Mainly do some kind of kill the animal for any of it.
They are weighing the meat before they bring it down to the road where they will sell it. The Iranian world is indeed vast and varied. Together, some 200 million people speak Iranian languages today. But the Iranians weren't the only Indo-European group to move out of Central Asia and head south. For that, we need to explore a little further, across the Hindu Kush. These are the Kalash valleys, part of the Hindu Kush mountain range in northwest Pakistan. Now the Kalash are special for a very particular reason. There are not many of them at all, and genetic analysis shows that they have been reproductively isolated for thousands of years. And they have a particularly high proportion of our familiar R1a Y chromosome haplogroup. The steppe ancestry, which is so well preserved in them, arrived between 3,500 and 4,000 years ago. Out of all populations in both South and Central Asia, they are the closest to the Bronze Age Central Asians, like the Sintashta. In other words, to look at a Kalasha person today is to see the closest thing that still exists to the human stock that was created when the first Indo-European speakers entered the Indian subcontinent. Not only that, they follow a religion that is related to the historical Vedic religion, the belief system that the steppe people brought with them as they moved south out of Central Asia. It's widely considered to be animist in the sense that it involves worshipping spirits, especially supernatural beings that live high in the mountains, ancestor worship, and an emphasis on purity and the sacredness of very specific areas where they live. I first stay in Bumbaret, the most populous and also most touristed of the Kalash valleys. People still live in the old houses, some of which are 300 years old.
These are used to make butter. Animal? Is it from an animal? That's made from a goat.
I visit the family home of my guide.
This is walnut bread. Mazidar. Mazidar.
The Kalash are many things, but a people with a prudent approach to workplace health and safety, they are not. Villages are divided into three. Cattle houses are at the top in what is called the pure area, where women aren't permitted. Houses are in the middle, considered impure because that's where fornication happens. And at the bottom are the fields and menstrual huts, where women still go every month during their periods. Women are not allowed to the places of worship, which is only done by the men. They still do animal sacrifice, at least sometimes, like at this altar up in the pure area of the village. Apart from this though, Kalasha religion doesn't have a lot of strict rules in terms of do's and don'ts, except at certain ritual times when they are strictly followed.
So this is a funeral house where they put the body for 3 days.
There are 3 days in the winter festival where Kalasha do not touch non-Kalasha, and all non-Kalasha are kept out of the village. Despite the strict rules with the menstrual huts, I also frequently saw men and women easily socializing together, which I essentially never saw anywhere else in Pakistan. These graves were typically left on top of the ground. It was tourists who came and opened them. I spoke to quite a few Kalasha who were not particularly enthusiastic about the tourism in their valleys. They took pains to clarify though, that it was really only domestic tourists who they say come and act disrespectfully. In Pakistan, there are widespread preconceptions about Kalasha girls, and many Pakistanis still casually refer to this area as Kafristan, or land of the infidels. For many Pakistani men, the sight of an uncovered woman's face is clearly thrilling. I travelled plenty throughout Pakistan, and though there were other places with tourists, nowhere else was it the local people themselves who were the attraction. These wooden statues, carved to honour the dead, are seldom made anymore. Many have been stolen. So much has changed that the best examples of Kalasha sculpture I found in a museum in Peshawar, the closest city over a day away.
These are Kalasha effigies.
I was told emphatically that to be Kalasha you must follow the religion. If you convert to another one, even if you still speak the Kalash language, you are not considered Kalasha. Conversion to Islam is considered by many Kalasha I talk to be a threat to their culture. That may be due to economic incentives, preaching in government schools, or simply the overall demographic weight of being a tiny population in a country that is around 97% Muslim. Now Bumbaret is roughly 70% Muslim, I was told. Hence why there are only some 3,000 or 4,000 Kalasha left, in total, in the world. I was planning on staying in Bumbaret for a couple of nights, but after one afternoon I had had enough. There was something about the dynamic I didn't like. So the next morning I headed over to the neighbouring valley, and was very glad that I did. Rumbor, compared to Bumbaret, was simply paradise. It was far, far more relaxed, and with almost no tourists. Men play cards on the street, clean their shops, and a boy climbs a tree to shake mulberries down for the woman to catch and dry in the sun. Up here in the mountains, instead of sugar, they often put salt in their tea.
And then do you put in sugar or no? No. Just salt? Okay, let's try this. It's good as it is.
At this time of year, many of the younger men have taken the cattle and horses up to the higher pastures to graze. They keep them up there for months, rotating shepherds every couple of weeks. The rest of the economy of the valley is centered around growing crops, and the irrigation they have developed to bring water from the river is unbelievably impressive. In material terms, the Kalash valleys are absolutely not wealthy places. Women still wash their clothes outside. Only the comparatively well-off might have a washing machine, and there are frequent power cuts and power surges from the little hydro generator nearby. This big box is necessary to stabilize the current. Your economic situation must be pretty challenging if you're spending your old age collecting firewood. Rumbor is a really lovely place in the afternoons and evenings, where men and women, boys and girls meet outside to chat. It has a real community feel. Everyone playing volleyball is Kalash, and they even invited me to play. They play almost every evening. There is one foreign resident living in Rumbor, a Japanese woman who converted to the Kalash religion and has lived in the village for some 20 years. She comes down to watch the volleyball as well. One evening I meet a man who shows me around his orchard.
This is the garden.
Oh, pomegranate.
Yeah, Kalash name is Dang. This sweet one. This one also, look. This is new one, new. This is my grandfather.
Your grandfather
Yeah.
planted this tree,
Yeah.
and you have always lived in the same house?
Yeah.
The Kalash, this offshoot of the Indo-European tree, have put down deep roots here. So, some 3,500 years ago, while the people that spread the Iranian languages were moving across the Iranian plateau and the steppe, a sister lineage of steppe-descended people were moving into the Indian subcontinent. By this point, for the first time in the story, we do know what they called themselves, and you may have heard of it. They called themselves the Aryans, as did the ancient Iranians, by the way, hence the name Iran. The Aryans entered the Indian subcontinent in the midst of the decline of one of the world's great prehistoric cultures, the Indus Valley Civilization. The Indus Valley Civilization was huge, old, and to some extent poorly understood. It spread out over a wide area, but had uniform weights and city design, and traded extensively with the Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex, and even Mesopotamia. We aren't certain what language it spoke because its script, or what we think is a script, hasn't been deciphered. For many years it was thought that the Aryans were the reason that the Indus Valley Civilization declined, though current scholarship leans more towards climactic change and the drying up of key rivers. As the Aryans moved in, they mixed with the people of the Indus Valley Civilization, creating what geneticists call the ancestral North Indians, who are about 30% Sintashta, 70% IVC. And, according to a 2019 genetics paper, the closest living thing we have to the original ancestral North Indians are the Kalash. The Kalash, according to this paper, are close to 100% ANI. This population, the ancestral North Indians, speaking what would become the Indo-Aryan languages, we'll return to in a moment, because a short walk from the Kalash villages sit another population that I was particularly interested to find. Interestingly, the Kalash language is not quite as unique as their religion, or indeed their genetics. It is part of the same group of Dardic languages found in this part of northern Pakistan, and part of the wider Indo-Aryan branch of Indo-European. It is special in its way, of course, and it's not mutually intelligible with other languages in its branch. But nearby there is another language that is even more singular, and to find that one, I would have to go walking. I had a name to ask for, Abdul Rahman, or perhaps his son, Jamal Rahman. Unfortunately, when I arrived, I found their house locked and nobody at home, so I sat for a while and contemplated my options. I was able to find some guys who were building a school.
Yeah.
They were friendly, and I asked them to speak some of their language for me. It's called Nuristani. Give it a listen. There's nothing else like it. Nuristani is a strange beast indeed. It used to be thought that you could divide this massive eastern world of Indo-European into two neat groups, the Iranian languages and the Indo-Aryan languages. But there was a third branch, roughly between the Iranian and Indo-Aryan branches, represented by a single set of 5 or 6 closely related languages, protected by their isolation in the mountains of Afghanistan. The branch is called Nuristani. The Nuristanis, too, used to practice a religion much like that of the Kalash until the end of the 19th century, when the Emir of Afghanistan started a campaign to forcibly convert them to Islam. One small group escaped across the border into what is now Pakistan, and they live just up the river valley from the Kalash. We simply don't know much at all about the ancient backstory of Nuristani. We don't know its original homeland. But here it is now, spoken by a few 100,000 people in Afghanistan and a couple of villages in Pakistan. I really love that these mysteries still exist, and it staggers me what these people have preserved. One of my friends from earlier kindly shows me around the village. Some of these houses on the ridge are over 100 years old. This guy lives in this house with his wife and his 5 children. And he offers to carry my bag as we explore the village. This village migrated across from Afghanistan over 100 years ago. Even though one of the reasons they left was to be able to keep practicing their historic religion, which was probably similar to that of the Kalash, sometime in the past century, maybe because of maintaining close links with their brethren in Afghanistan, they ended up converting to Islam as well. As a result, it is visibly more conservative than in the Kalash areas. From here, the western valley goes up to Afghanistan. Nuristan in Afghanistan is a day's walk away with horses, some 18 kilometers. Everyone here has connections there. One nation, I was told. In another part of the village, I sit on the grass with some of the guys, and this man explains to me their connection with the rest of the Nuristanis in Afghanistan.
Here we are one family people.
You're connected to them up
We
there.
are connected. So the terrorism is not attacked to on this side here. We are not support of the terrorists and not have support of the terrorist works.
These men have lived more or less their entire lives in this one spectacularly beautiful valley. They farm and they live. These hills they know intimately because they've never known any others. If you're going to make one place your whole world, there are certainly worse places. As it got later, a man was assigned to walk me out of the village. I wonder if this was so they knew where I was, and not just wandering around by myself.
Right. Thank you so much. Shukriya. Nice to meet you. It's nice to meet you too.
As I head back down the valley, two women returning to the village turn to hide their faces. Up here in these remote mountain valleys survive cultures that are isolated and unique. But still a part of the great story of the Indo-Europeans. So the Iranian, Nuristani, and Indo-Aryan languages were once united, some 4,000 years ago. The split between the branches is estimated to be around 2000 BCE, quite possibly when the settlements at Sintashta were established. By the time the Indo-Aryans enter the Indian subcontinent and mix with the leftovers of the Indus Valley civilization, we have a name for their language: Sanskrit. While the people who became the Iranians dominated Central Asia, Iran, and the Steppe, the bulk of the Indo-Aryans headed southeast around 3,800 years ago. One small set, though, headed southwest, where they wound up in Syria, and we find inscriptions in Sanskrit being carved into stone in the kingdom of Mitanni. We have no idea why they went there, and Sanskrit soon died out, if it was ever spoken widely there at all. But the main branch of the Indo-Aryans wound their way through the Hindu Kush. By 1200 BCE, we have ancient burials with steppe ancestry and steppe practices in the Swat Valley of Pakistan. So the Indo-Aryans enter North India and spread out. They were likely still herders if their holy texts are anything to go by, which were composed in Sanskrit. Today, around 80% of the population of the Indian subcontinent, from Pakistan to Bangladesh and Nepal to Sri Lanka, speaks Indo-European languages, all descended from Sanskrit. Sanskrit itself probably died as a vernacular sometime in the first millennium, disintegrating just like Latin did in Europe into a myriad of daughter languages. Hindi is the biggest, and its sister Urdu, but other giants include Bengali, the sixth most spoken language in the world, and Marathi, which has almost 100 million speakers. Way down in Sri Lanka, Sinhalese, too, is Indo-European. Sanskrit even reached Southeast Asia in the early first millennium with Indian maritime traders, where it was used as the language of priests and kings for 1,000 years in Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia. You know Angkor Wat? Inscriptions in Sanskrit, because that was the religious language of the people who built it. It never was used very much outside of an elite context though, so now the Indo-European world ends at the borders of India and in the south, Sri Lanka. Once again, we can see this in genetics. Roughly 15% of the ancestry of the whole Indian subcontinent is from the steppe. In some groups, it is as high as 30%. While the Kalash in Pakistan are quite a neat mixture of steppe ancestry with that of the IVC, virtually everyone else in the subcontinent sits somewhere on a continuum between this steppe IVC mix and the ancestral South Indians who preceded them. The closest population to those ancestral South Indians are today's Andaman Islanders. South Asians who speak languages descended from Sanskrit today carry more steppe ancestry than those who speak non-Indo-European languages. For many years, people from places like Bangladesh in the northeast of the subcontinent who got their ancestry tested by commercial companies would often get a result that showed a splash of European heritage. This was, for a long time, explained away as some sort of error, and geneticists would fiddle with the parameters to make it go away. We now know that it wasn't an error. The people that came down into India and spread the languages spoken by more than 3/4 of people in the Indian subcontinent have their origins in the steppe, but arrived in the subcontinent via Europe. Those results are an echo of the European farmer ancestry that mixed with the Yamnaya all those centuries before that created the corded Ware, an almost 5,000 kilometer migration that took a millennium and a half. Even in the furthest reaches of South India and in the non-Indo-European speaking groups with the lowest steppe ancestry, percentages are still in the high single digits. Today, the Indo-Iranian branch, meaning both the Indo-Aryan branch of the subcontinent and the Iranian branch, includes more than 300 languages spoken by around 1.7 billion people. It is the biggest of them all, and demographically is really the main event of the Indo-European story. But the Aryans didn't just bring their language. They brought an entire cultural package. And that system of beliefs, almost unique in the story of the Indo-European expansions, has evolved into one of the biggest religions in human history. This is Varanasi, one of the holiest cities in Hinduism, if not the holiest. Today, 1.2 billion people call themselves Hindus. Hinduism is of course varied, astonishingly so, but Hindus across the globe are unified by their adherence to the concept of Dharma, the cosmic order maintained through ritual and righteous living. Hinduism is found in the spectacular festivals and ancient architecture, of course, but it's also in the everyday rituals, the offering of flowers, the icons, the prayer beads, the neighborhood temples, the burning of incense, and the veneration of the cow. Hinduism has taken on countless local expressions, woven into the landscape and the rhythm of ordinary life. But Hinduism is not only of India. It is also the Indian flowering of something older, a branch of a much wider family of myths, languages, and beliefs that once stretched across Eurasia. And if we look at what genetics, linguistics, and archaeology now tell us, the story of the origins of Hinduism is also the story of the Indo-Europeans. The oldest texts in Hinduism are called the Vedas, and they are written in Sanskrit. They were transmitted orally for at least 1,000 years before first being written down, and they describe a world of pastoralists, epic male warriors, and the horse. In the Rig Veda, the oldest of these texts from more than 3,000 years ago, they ride chariots, just as the Indo-Aryans did. Horses, for example, were probably unknown to the people of the Indus Valley civilization, yet are throughout the oldest Hindu texts. In the Indian epic, the Mahabharata, Krishna gives advice on the proper method of the Ashvamedha, the horse sacrifice, the supreme kingly ritual in the Vedas. And you know where horse sacrifices have been found, and in almost the exact way as instructed in the Vedas? Way back on the Russian steppe, in Sintashta, the first site which gave its name to the Sintashta culture. In fact, there are parallels for all this stuff throughout the lands that the Indo-Europeans conquered. Everywhere they went, they left a cult of the horse. Ancient Greek, Roman, Norse, and Hindu gods arrived via horse-drawn chariot. The ancient Romans sacrificed horses to Mars. They did the same in Ireland. The last pagan king of Sweden to sacrifice a horse was in AD 1080. We used to see these as coincidences, but there's a good reason to think that they aren't. Horses are an Indo-European obsession. The Vedas describe the passage of the Aryans into India, as well as places in the Hindu Kush and Punjab. Putting these clues together with linguistics, scholars estimate that the Rig Veda, the oldest of the Vedas, was first composed between 1500 and 1200 BCE. That's around the same time, or maybe a little later, as those inscriptions we found all the way over in Syria. The kings of Mitanni also invoked the Vedic gods in their peace treaties. A few centuries later, around 1000 BCE, the oldest texts of Zoroastrianism were composed, in Avestan. According to Laura Spinney, Zarathustra, the founder of Zoroastrianism, and the Vedic poets were very much aligned in their manner of thought and expression. Though he criticized their celebration of conquest and sacrifice, he referred to the same gods and rituals as them, and used the same poetic devices. He and they are so much on the same wavelength that many linguists think Sanskrit and Avestan might still have been mutually intelligible at the time that they were working, or at least that they had not split very long before. Hinduism hasn't stayed the same though, and the supreme gods of the Vedas, like Indra, Agni, and Varuna, amongst others, by the Common Era had been overshadowed by the Hindu gods and their many incarnations you might know of today, Shiva, Krishna, and Kali, as well as many, many more. As Hinduism moved through the subcontinent, it evolved and it absorbed plenty from the cultures that were brought into it. But a large part of Hinduism's foundation, and, very importantly, its language, Sanskrit, is ultimately from the steppe. To say that the Vedas were brought into the subcontinent by the Aryans, who ultimately descended from steppe herders, is not, in my eyes, to say that Hinduism today is not an Indian religion. In fact, To me, it is even cooler that Hindus can identify themselves with the greatest cultural and demographic expansion in history. And when they listen or read to those holiest of texts, they are tapping into the psychic world of the most successful conquerors the world has ever known. But here it gets even wilder. This distribution of steppe ancestry in the Indian subcontinent is massively variable, and its determining factor, almost as much as geography, is caste. Put simply, caste is a system in the Indian subcontinent that divides people into rigid groups based on birth. Traditionally, it determines what job you do and who you marry, and is highly stratified. The lower castes and those outside the caste system are considered impure and often not allowed into many temples, while those at the top, the Brahmins, were traditionally the more pure priestly class. Genetics shows that some subcastes, called jatis, have been effectively genetically isolated for as long as 2,000 years. And it was the Brahmins, those that sit atop the Indian caste system, who were traditionally the custodians of Hinduism and of Sanskrit. They were the ones allowed to do the holiest of rituals. 3,000 years after the arrival of the Aryans, can you guess which group shows the most Yamnaya ancestry? The Brahmins. There is a geographic component, to be clear, with people in the northwest, where the Aryans entered, having more of it than in the south, but the results are undeniable. The upper castes of the Indian subcontinent, from the far north to the very south, have substantially more steppe ancestry than the lower castes. Just like everywhere else they went, the steppe men made themselves an elite. I want to introduce one caveat here. There is a minority of scholars who reject the entire story that I've told you. They subscribe to something called the out of India theory, which posits that the Indo-European languages originated in India and spread out from there. It has become a plank of modern Hindu nationalism. Without getting into excessive detail, this is a bit of a stretch. The one thing that the out of India people do have on their side is that because of the climate of the subcontinent, very little ancient DNA has been preserved and studied, or at least released to the public, that can give us a contemporaneous snapshot of what Indian genetics looked like at different moments in the past 3,000 years. Also, because the script of the Indus Valley civilization has yet to be deciphered, we can't read their language, so we can't say for certain that they didn't speak Sanskrit or another Indo-European language. But we do have the modern genetics and the many problems with the theory itself. Almost no scholars deny that there was a migration into India around this time, even if the out of India people deny that those people brought Sanskrit. But it's there in the Vedas, the oldest texts of Hinduism, which were clearly the product of a pastoral people oriented around the horse, which don't thrive naturally in India. We also have steppe genetics in the Swat Valley around 1200 BCE, and we see that same genetic signal in Indian populations today. The only candidate we really have for a culture that could have spread the Indo-European languages out of India is the Indus Valley civilization. And if the IVC was cradle of Sanskrit and Hinduism, there is essentially no evidence, genetic or otherwise, of IVC people moving in large numbers north out of the continent, except in the smallest quantities as traders, which they would need to do in order to plant the rest of the Indo-European languages where they are today. And if it wasn't the IVC that nurtured the Indo-European languages, then we have no other plausible culture that anyone has identified, either in archaeology or in a genetic signature, that could have spread them. Also, if North India was the source of the Indo-European languages, why did they spread as far as Britain, but not to South India? The splits of the Indo-European branches, as estimated by historical linguistics, don't add up either. Reconstructions that linguists have been working on for centuries show Tocharian and the European languages splitting first, followed much later by the Indo-Iranian languages. As Spinney puts it, proponents of the out-of-India theory have made very little effort to explain how the other Indo-European languages ended up where they did. The out-of-India theory, to me, seems like a political project more than anything else, though I do understand the reaction to being told your religion came from elsewhere. And because the theory is subscribed to by a lot of people in India, I did think it was worth mentioning. History may be written by the victors, but it isn't written by nomads. South Asian agricultural civilization is very different from the nomadism of the Indo-Aryans. So is Iranian culture and European. This is the pattern continued: elite men invading, disproportionately reproducing and introducing their language, but ultimately adopting the way of life of the settled people they conquered. As Razib writes, in the process, the conquerors were culturally conquered, and their increasingly distant connection to the steppe was forgotten along the way. So, a quick review of how far we've come. Around 5,000 years ago, there was a group of steppe pastoralists living on the Pontic steppe, who we call the Yamnaya. One set of them rode the length of the steppe, probably to eventually birth the now extinct culture of the Tocharians. Others drove into Europe, mixing with farmers, eventually resulting in the Celtic, Italic, Germanic, Baltic, and Slavic languages. Separate pulses into the Balkans and Caucasus gave us Albanian, Greek, and Armenian. Then, after 1,000 years in Europe, some go nomad again and head back east, giving us the modern horse and eventually splitting into the Iranian languages, Nuristani languages, and the languages of northern India, as well as bringing the religious traditions that became Hinduism into the subcontinent. And all of this happened between about 3000 and 1000 BCE. It's incredible. We have a picture in which nearly half of Northern Europeans' modern ancestry, 20 to 40% of Southern Europeans, and 10 to 20% of South Asian ancestry can be traced directly back to the Pontic steppe. Then, with the European colonization of the Americas and the destruction of the Native Americans that happened as a result, the languages of the steppe conquered another entire hemisphere. Whether it be English or French or Spanish or Portuguese, from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, the vast majority of people in North and South America speak a language that descends from the steppe. And then take a look at Africa. French, English, and Portuguese are among the most commonly spoken languages there. If you take all humankind from every continent, around 15% of our total ancestry comes from the people of the steppe. Today, the R1b haplogroup, characteristic of the core Yamnaya and the Beakers, is carried by some 110 million men in Europe. R1a, the dominant lineage of the corded Ware in most of northern and eastern Europe, is found from Bengal to Sri Lanka to Central Europe. It's there in the Swat Valley in 1200 BCE, and it's there today in massive numbers in South Asia. 20% of men in the Indian subcontinent share the same common male ancestor as around half the Slavic-speaking world, totaling some 810 million people. All these men share a common father only 5,500 years ago. As Razib writes, the Y chromosomes tell us these conquering waves were led by bands of men related to a ruling clan, and their dominance was such that this tribe of thousands would go on to sire descendants numbering in the hundreds of millions. The great Kurgan mounds are a legacy still visible to us all, but in their flesh and bone the scions of the Yamnaya walk among us, the potent tones of their nomadic ancestors rolling off billions of tongues around the world every day. So that is it. The story of the Indo-Europeans. There may be more discoveries to come, and there are still kinks to be worked out, but that will probably be more like plugging gaps. The broad picture, brought to us by archaeology, linguistics, and genetics, is now fairly clear. So, in a sense, the Indo-Europeans did conquer the world. Much of the linguistic geography of Eurasia had been set by about 3,000 years ago. Much, but not all. Because now would come a new set of people, and they too would come from the steppe. People speaking a completely different language, a people who reached the gates of Europe and stayed there. Recent arrivals in the story of Eurasia, they would rule over other peoples in vast empires before finally giving their name to the last place they finally conquered. A people who you may not even know came from the steppe at all. The Turks were coming.
Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. It took a lot of work putting this together, and this channel is basically just me at this point. So if you'd like to support what I do so that I can put out more videos, just like my friend Dino, who bought me this incredibly nifty ND filter, head to lostincontext.com. If not, no problem. I will see you in the next video. Thank you for watching.